Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Peking Man Fossils, Zhoukoudian, China. In December 1941, wooden crates packed with some of the most irreplaceable human fossils ever excavated were loaded for transport out of Beijing. Inside those crates sat the original Peking Man material, gathered from the limestone caves of Zhoukoudian, about 50 kilometers southwest of the capital. Within days, the crates were gone. What survived were photographs, plaster casts, anatomical drawings, and field measurements. Almost a century later, those secondary records still serve as the body of evidence for one of the 20th century's most important fossil populations. Zhoukoudian is not a single cave, but a complex of fissures and chambers cut into a hillside. Excavations between 1927 and 1937 recovered skull caps, lower jaws, isolated teeth, cranial fragments, and a small number of postcranial bones. Davidson Black, a Canadian anatomist working in Beijing, classified the early material under the name Sinanthropus pekinensis in 1927. Later researchers folded that classification into the broader species Homo erectus, where it still sits today. The total pre-war collection contained close to 200 fossil pieces, representing at least 40 individuals. That makes the disappearance not the loss of a single skull, but the loss of an entire archive of early human evolution. Each skull cap carried the same general signature: thick cranial bones, heavy brow ridges, a low and elongated vault, and powerful chewing anatomy at the rear of the jaw. Compared to a modern human skull, which typically holds a brain volume of around 1,400 cubic centimeters, the Peking Man skulls averaged about 1,000 cubic centimeters. That figure sits comfortably inside the expected Homo erectus range and reflects an evolutionary midpoint between earlier hominins and later humans. The Zhoukoudian deposits also produced evidence of stone tools, butchered animal bones, and repeated occupation layers spanning roughly 780,000 to 400,000 years ago. Burnt material in some layers has long been cited as possible early evidence of fire use, although the interpretation has been debated for decades. Franz Weidenreich, the German-American anatomist who took over scientific direction after Black's death in 1934, produced detailed monographs, measurements, and a full set of plaster casts. Those casts and his published photographs became the working substitutes once the originals were gone. Modern analysis on the original fossils is impossible. Researchers cannot extract DNA, sample proteins, run isotope analysis on tooth enamel, take histological slides of bone, or generate high-resolution micro-CT scans. Every modern biomolecular technique that has reshaped human origins research since the 1990s simply cannot be applied. What remains accessible is shape, proportion, and surface detail recorded in 2 dimensions. The disappearance itself unfolded against the backdrop of the Japanese advance into northern China and the outbreak of the Pacific War. As tensions rose, the fossils were packed for evacuation, intended for transfer to United States Marines stationed in Beijing, and onward shipment to a vessel in the Pacific. Somewhere along that chain, the crates vanished. The leading theories include interception by Japanese forces, loss at sea after a ship was sunk, secret hiding by individuals trying to protect them, opportunistic theft, or simple mishandling within a collapsing military logistics network. Decades of searches, including private expeditions and academic appeals, have produced no recovery. The case has become one of the great cold case mysteries of paleoanthropology. Zhoukoudian did not just lose fossils. It lost the original evidence behind one of humanity's oldest faces. The next case looks similar on the surface, but the disappearance involves something less tangible than crates of bone. It involves the disappearance of certainty itself. Number 2. The Solo Man Ngandong skulls, Java, Indonesia. On a river terrace above the Solo River in central Java between 1931 and 1933, Dutch colonial geologists and local workers exposed a bone bed that would reshape the timeline of Homo erectus. The Ngandong site eventually yielded 12 cranial vaults, often called calvaria, and 2 tibiae. Those fossils are widely classified as late Asian Homo erectus, sometimes given the subspecies label Homo erectus soloensis. Unlike the Peking Man case, the Ngandong skulls were not physically lost. They survived the 20th century. What weakened, instead, was the clean field documentation that scientists rely on to reconstruct exactly how and when the bones entered the deposit. Karl ter Haar identified the site. W.F.F. Oppenorth led much of the early excavation. G.H.R. von Koenigswald later took the fossils into a broader comparative framework, and after the Second World War, he worked alongside Franz Weidenreich in New York, where Asian Homo erectus material was being studied as a single research program. The anatomy of the Ngandong skulls is striking. They show flattened cranial profiles, thick cranial walls, strong brow ridges, and the elongated brain case, typical of Homo erectus. Cranial capacity in the Ngandong sample runs roughly between 1150 and 1300 cubic centimeters. That range is significant. It overlaps the lower end of the modern human range, while preserving an unambiguously archaic skull form. In modern terms, these were people whose brains were nearly the size of ours, packaged in heads that looked nothing like ours. The chronology has been revised several times. A 2020 dating study placed the Ngandong bone bed between approximately 117,000 and 108,000 years ago. If that range holds, Ngandong represents one of the last known surviving populations of Homo erectus anywhere on Earth, persisting in Southeast Asia long after the species had disappeared from Africa. Some researchers have linked their disappearance to environmental change. As rainforest expanded across Java, the open and semi-open habitats favored by Homo erectus likely contracted. The taphonomy of the site is equally important. The fossils came from a river terrace deposit where flooding, debris jams, and mudflows can concentrate skulls and animal bones in unusual ways. Skulls, being hollow and roughly spherical, behave differently in moving water than long limb bones. They tend to roll, settle, and accumulate, which is why some river deposits preserve a disproportionate number of cranial elements. That detail matters because it affects how researchers interpret the assemblage. Was Ngandong a death site, a redeposition site, or both? The Second World War interrupted study. The Japanese occupation of Java and the political upheaval that followed disrupted field notes, museum routines, and continuity of expertise. One of the Ngandong skulls was taken to Tokyo during the war and only returned in December 1946. The fossils survived. The precise story of how each one entered the river terrace did not. The next, vanished discovery raises a different problem entirely. A skull that survives in a museum drawer, but whose scientific identity collapsed under public scrutiny. Number 3. The Calaveras Skull, California Gold Country. In 1866, in a mining shaft in Calaveras County, California, miners claimed to have recovered a human skull from gravels lying about 130 feet underground. The gravels were auriferous, meaning gold-bearing, and geologically ancient by any reasonable interpretation. The find reached Josiah Whitney, the state geologist of California, and a serious scientific authority of his era. Whitney concluded that the skull represented extraordinarily ancient humanity in North America, possibly extending back into what was then loosely called Pliocene time. The implications were enormous. If true, the Calaveras skull would have rewritten the human timeline in the Americas, pushing it back by millions of years. Whitney published his analysis and defended the find for the rest of his career. The skull traveled the lecture circuit and appeared in scientific reports throughout the late 19th century. The anatomical problem appeared almost immediately. The skull did not look like a deep-time fossil. It resembled a relatively recent Native American skull, with proportions, sutures, and surface features consistent with people who had lived in the region within the last several centuries. That mismatch points to a critical principle in archaeology. The age of an object is not the same as the age of the deposit it sits in. A recent skull can be placed accidentally or deliberately into ancient sediment. The question is always whether the object and the layer share a history. William Henry Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution emerged as the leading critic. He visited the area, examined the find conditions, and argued the skull could not have come from where the miners claimed. Later, analyses placed the human material at probably less than 1,000 years old. Genuine ancient animal fossils did exist in the region's gravels, which gave the hoax its surface plausibility. A miner who picked up a real mammoth tooth nearby could easily believe ancient humans must also be buried there. Gold Rush mining camps had a thriving culture of jokes, exaggerations, and anti-academic pranks. Local accounts identified John Scribner and other associates with the practical joke tradition surrounding the find. The skull itself reportedly survives in museum custody to this day, but its scientific claim to deep antiquity is gone. The object is on the shelf. The discovery is not. The Calaveras case is a reminder that a find can disappear from science without ever physically leaving the building. Photographs and lithographs documented the controversy throughout the late 1800s, but no image could prove the original find spot. The next vanished discovery raises a different question entirely. What happens when scientific access ends, not through hoax or loss, but because the dead are returned home? Number 4. Mungo Man, Lake Mungo, Australia. In 1974, geologist Jim Bowler was working among the dry lake beds and shifting dunes of western New South Wales when erosion exposed a human burial. The remains, catalogued as LM3 and widely known as Mungo Man, lay in a deflated dune system on the edge of Lake Mungo. The burial was dated to approximately 42,000 years old, making it one of the oldest known burials anywhere in the world and one of the deepest pieces of evidence for human presence in Australia. The cultural significance is layered. The lands belong to the Pakantai, or Pakanchi, Muti, and Nyampaa peoples. Their ancestors lived along the Willandra Lakes when those basins still held water, supporting fish, mussels, and water birds. Mungo Man's burial was ochre-stained, indicating deliberate ceremonial treatment of the body. Red ochre, in this context, is more than pigment. It signals symbolic behavior, ritual practice, and the presence of structured funerary customs in Pleistocene Australia. The Willandra Lakes region received World Heritage recognition in 1981. The area preserves not only Mungo Man and the earlier discovered Mungo Lady, dated to a similar time horizon, but also stone tools, hearth remains, and footprint trackways. In modern terms, the Willandra system is a Pleistocene cultural landscape, comparable in scientific weight to early European cave art sites. Scientific study after the 1974 discovery produced dates, anatomical descriptions, casts, field notes, and photographs. During the same broader period, 106 other ancestral remains were removed from the Willandra Lakes region. Most of that work occurred in the 1960s and 70s, during an era when archaeological practice routinely moved indigenous remains to university and museum facilities without community consent. For decades, Mungo Man was held at the Australian National University in Canberra. That custody became increasingly contested. Repatriation campaigns framed the issue around indigenous sovereignty, ancestral rest, and the right of communities to make decisions about their own dead. In 2017, Mungo Man was returned to country. In 2022, after federal approval, both Mungo Man and Mungo Lady were reburied. The community itself was divided. Some elders supported full reburial. Others preferred a keeping place, a culturally managed facility where remains could be stored under indigenous authority while remaining available for limited, consented research. Future direct study of Mungo Man now depends on cultural authority rather than institutional access. Photographs, casts, and prior scientific reports remain, but new sampling for DNA, isotopes, or microscopic analysis is not on the table without community consent. Mungo Man did not vanish by accident. He vanished from laboratories because he was returned to country. The next discovery shows how a skeleton can survive in a museum while its original position in the ground disappears forever. Number 5. The Tabun Woman of Mount Carmel, Tabun Cave, Israel. Tabun Cave sits on the western slope of Mount Carmel, in a corridor that has carried human and pre-human populations between Africa, Asia, and Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. Between 1929 and 1934, the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod led major excavations at the cave. In 1932, her team exposed a nearly complete skeleton, catalogued as Tabun C1 and often called the Tabun Woman. The local excavator Yusra, a Palestinian woman who worked closely with Garrod, is often credited with finding the skeleton during the cave excavation. The skeleton was photographed in situ before removal. Those photographs preserve the body's posture, articulation, sediment contact, and excavation sequence. In modern archaeological work, in situ photography is treated as primary data rather than illustration. It records relationships between bones that vanish the moment lifting begins. Once a skeleton is moved, the original three-dimensional arrangement, the way the skull contacted the sediment, the angle of the limbs, and the position of any associated objects can never be reconstructed exactly. Tabun C1 is usually interpreted as a female Neanderthal or a Neanderthal-like Levantine human. The dating has been a long-running debate. Estimates range from roughly 130,000 years ago, based on some sediment layer interpretations, to around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago in other models. The wide range matters because the Levant is a region where Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens both lived, sometimes within tens of thousands of years of each other, and the timing of any individual skeleton affects how researchers reconstruct the overlap. The surviving bones are fragmentary but scientifically essential. They sit in museum collections, where they have been studied and restudied for nearly a century. Nearby Skull Cave, on the same mountain, produced different human remains that are more closely associated with early modern humans. Together, Tabun and Skull anchor the Levantine record of Middle Paleolithic populations. The loss in this case is contextual rather than physical. Removing the skeleton from the cave destroyed the exact articulated relationship between the bones and the surrounding sediment. Modern techniques that did not exist in 1932, including sediment DNA recovery, microstratigraphic analysis, burial chemistry, and residue mapping of bone surfaces, can no longer be applied to the original burial scene. The bones survived. The cave context did not. The early excavation photographs now function like a frozen excavation trench. Researchers can study angle, position, and surrounding stone, but they cannot return to the moment of discovery. The museum kept the woman's bones. The cave kept the one context that could never be reconstructed. From a cave floor in the Levant, the next case moves to a museum wing destroyed from the sky. Number 6. The Berlin Mammoth and Pleistocene Megafauna Collection, Museum für Naturkunde. Before the Second World War, Berlin's Museum für Naturkunde was one of Europe's major natural history institutions. Its holdings included zoological, paleontological, mineralogical, and fossil collections gathered across more than a century of expeditions and exchanges. The museum's Ice Age mammal collections held mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, cave lions, cave hyenas, and a wide range of other Pleistocene megafauna. The disaster came on the 3rd of February, 1945, during the bombing of Berlin. The east wing of the museum was heavily damaged, and the structure later collapsed. The destruction did not happen all at once. Bomb blast, fire, falling masonry, water from firefighting, and dust contamination unfolded across hours and days. Post-war displacement of staff and material added further disruption. Some specimens were not burned but buried under debris, which in some cases preserved them, and in other cases delayed identification for decades. Large fossils are particularly difficult to evacuate. Mounted skeletons rely on heavy steel armatures, plaster supports, glass cases, and fixed display infrastructure. Disassembly takes weeks. Beginning in April 1943, museum staff began moving key specimens to protected storage outside the city. Some iconic objects were saved. Other material, especially heavy mounts and large fossils, remained vulnerable. Pleistocene megafauna are scientifically valuable for reasons that go far beyond display. Type specimens, the original bones used to define a species, anchor naming, classification, and comparison. When a type specimen is destroyed or separated from its label, the entire framework around that species' name becomes harder to maintain. Orphaned specimens, bones without their associated catalog cards, lose much of their scientific identity. A mammoth molar without provenance becomes just a tooth. What survived the war became dependent on early catalogs, glass plate photographs, inventory cards, and measurements taken before 1943. Those records carry forward the institutional memory of what was there, what was lost, and what may still be recoverable from post-war storage. Destroyed fossils cannot be sampled for collagen, isotopes, paleoproteins, ancient DNA, or bone histology. The molecular revolution in paleontology, which now routinely extracts protein sequences from Ice Age bones, simply cannot reach a specimen that no longer exists. Some surviving war-damaged specimens still carry shrapnel scars and heat discoloration, physical reminders of the night the East Wing fell. The museum became, in a sense, a fossil site of its own. Ice Age animals that had died once in tundra and steppe were buried a second time in brick and ash. The next site shows a quieter threat to ancient evidence, not bombing, but air itself. Number 7. The Stara Zagora Neolithic House, Bulgaria. In 1969, rescue archaeology in the western part of Stara Zagora, Bulgaria, uncovered an early Neolithic burned dwelling preserved with remarkable completeness. The structure dates to the beginning of the 6th millennium BC, roughly 8,000 years old. The house measures approximately 10 meters by 5.8 meters and originally stood about 7 meters high. According to the museum that protects it, 3 families lived in the dwelling. The construction technique was typical of southeastern European early farming villages. Wooden stakes formed the vertical frame. Woven rods filled the walls. A coating of clay mixed with straw covered the woven structure, producing a wall system functionally similar to wattle and daub. The upper portions used clay block construction, comparable to early mud brick. The interior contained 2 rooms on the first floor and a single room on the second. The dwelling preserved a complete domestic inventory: furnaces, hand mills for grinding grain, granaries for storing it, ceramic vessels for cooking and serving, and cult columns associated with household ritual. Each room contained approximately 60 ceramic vessels. That number alone reveals a population using pottery at industrial intensity for its time. In modern terms, a single household held more ceramic storage than a typical present-day apartment, because cooking, fermenting, brewing, and storing food were all done in clay. The reason this house survived to be excavated at all is fire. The structure burned in antiquity. Burning hardened the clay walls into a ceramic-like material, preserving the architecture in a way that unfired mud brick almost never achieves. Ancient catastrophe became the engine of preservation. Without the fire, the dwelling would have dissolved into the ground within centuries. The Neolithic Dwellings Museum, built around the find, now provides the modern protective setting. The site sits on UNESCO's tentative list of World Heritage candidates and remains one of the most complete preserved Neolithic domestic interiors in Europe. The danger to the house did not end with excavation. Exposed mud brick and burnt clay are vulnerable to humidity, salt crystallization, temperature shifts, handling pressure, and biological growth from fungi, bacteria, and insects. The first moments of exposure are often the most dangerous. Air, water vapor, and microbial life all rush into a space that had been sealed for 8,000 years. Emergency conservation is built around this vulnerability. Excavation photography captures the first exposed arrangement before supports, consolidants, and protective museum structures alter the scene. The house survived because of ancient catastrophe and modern intervention. The next site shows how even a sealed masterpiece can begin to disappear, simply because people come to admire it. Number 8. The Lascaux Bull Panel, pre-1963 state. Lascaux Cave sits in the Dordogne region of southwestern France. It was discovered in September 1940, when local teenagers followed a fallen tree into a hidden opening. Abbé Henri Breuil, then one of the leading authorities on prehistoric art in Europe, authenticated and studied the paintings shortly afterward. Official framing places the art around 21,000 years old, though common charcoal-based references for some images cluster closer to 17,000 years ago. The Hall of Bulls is the most famous chamber. It contains a sequence of large aurochs and other animal figures, some of them stretching about 5 meters in length. Across the cave's many galleries, hundreds of painted animals and a much larger number of engravings cover the walls. The pigments include charcoal blacks, iron-rich reds, and yellow ochres, applied with techniques that included blowing through hollow tubes, brushwork, and direct finger marking. Before public access began, the cave preserved its art unusually well. Temperature, humidity, airflow, microbial populations, and carbon dioxide levels had remained balanced for thousands of years. A closed cave is, in effect, a sealed ecosystem. The painting survived because nothing fundamental about that ecosystem had changed. Public access began in 1948. Visitor numbers climbed to roughly 100,000 people per year. Each visitor introduced warmth, breath, moisture, skin particles, fungal spores, and bacteria into the cave's atmosphere. Artificial lighting added another problem. Lamps encouraged the growth of algae and other photosynthetic organisms on damp surfaces, producing visible green patches near the entrances and along well-lit walls. Condensation began running over painted surfaces, carrying mineral salts that crystallized and damaged pigment layers. In 1963, the French Minister of Culture, André Malraux, closed the cave to the public. Conservation battles since then have targeted mold, fungi, algae, lichens, bacteria, and mineral crystals, each requiring different chemical and environmental responses. The pre-1963 saturation of color, the original surface sheen, and the untouched atmosphere can no longer be restored exactly. Photographs taken before public opening now serve as the reference standard for what the paintings looked like in their original environmental state. Lascaux II, a partial replica built nearby and opened in 1983, offers visitors a substitute experience. Later digital reconstructions and full-scale facsimile facilities have extended that approach. The original cave remains closed to nearly all visitors, with access tightly restricted to conservation specialists. Lascaux did not vanish in darkness. It began to vanish under admiration. Number 9. The Mosul Museum and the was not accidental exposure. It was filmed as deliberate spectacle. Number 9. The Mosul Museum and the Tel Halaf reliefs, Iraq and Syria. On the 26th of February, 2015, video footage released by Islamic State militants showed fighters destroying objects inside the Mosul Museum in northern Iraq. The museum held artifacts from ancient northern Mesopotamia, including material from Assyrian and Hatra sites. The video showed militants using hammers, sledgehammers, and pneumatic drills against statues, reliefs, and large-scale sculptures. Galleries inside the museum and stone reliefs at the nearby Nergal Gate, an Assyrian-era city gate of Nineveh, were both targeted. Subsequent analysis revealed a complication. Not every object visible in the video was necessarily an original. Some pieces were plaster casts or reconstructions used for display, while others were genuine ancient artifacts. The destruction was real, but the inventory of what exactly was destroyed required careful reconstruction by international researchers. UNESCO documentation, pre-2015 museum catalogs, tourist photographs, and even social media images all became forensic evidence after the fact. The mechanics of the destruction matter. Stone reliefs and carved statues are vulnerable to impact damage in specific ways. Faces, noses, limbs, and inscribed cuneiform texts shatter first because they project outward from the body of the sculpture. The destruction served two functions at once. It produced material loss, and it produced propaganda, with the camera as an essential tool of both. A separate but parallel case exists in the Tel Halaf reliefs. Max von Oppenheim, a German diplomat and amateur archaeologist, excavated the site of Tel Halaf in northeastern Syria between 1911 and 1913. He recovered monumental stone reliefs from an Aramaean palace and shipped much of the material to Berlin, where it was displayed in a private museum. During the Second World War, bombing in 1943 destroyed the Tel Halaf Museum and shattered the reliefs into tens of thousands of fragments. For decades, the fragments sat in storage. Beginning in 2001, the Tel Halaf Restoration Project worked through approximately 27,000 fragments, reassembling more than 30 major sculptures. Pre-war black and white photographs guided that reconstruction. Researchers could see how each relief had originally looked, match fracture surfaces, and rebuild the sculptures piece by piece. Reassembled reliefs went on display in Berlin starting in 2011. The Tel Halaf destruction occurred in Berlin, not in Syria, and not at the Mosul Museum. Conflating the two cases produces a misleading picture. What links them is the role of older photographs in either documenting loss or guiding recovery. Photogrammetry, three-dimensional modeling, digital reconstruction, and museum inventory recovery now form a standard toolkit for post-destruction heritage work. One camera recorded destruction. Older cameras helped put another ruined collection back together. The final case widens the frame from a gallery of statues to an entire national museum, losing thousands of small objects across a few hours. Number 10. The Iraq Museum, Late Prehistoric Artifacts. 2003 looting. The National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad was looted in the chaos following the United States-led invasion of Iraq. The looting window opened around the 10th of April, 2003, and lasted approximately 36 hours. By the time order was restored, roughly 15,000 objects had been stolen from the museum. Museum staff, anticipating the danger, had already secured 8,366 artifacts in protected storage before the looting began. Without that pre-conflict action, the losses would have been substantially worse. Recovery has been partial. Thousands of objects have been returned through international cooperation, customs seizures, and voluntary surrender. Thousands more remain missing. The categories of stolen material favored portable, high-value items. Cylinder seals, clay tablets, amulets, figurines, beads, small ceramic vessels, and small bronzes accounted for most of the loss. Some reports estimated that about 5,000 valuable cylinder seals were among the missing items. A point of common confusion deserves clarification. The artifacts spanned multiple periods of Mesopotamian prehistory and history, including Ubaid period material from roughly the 6th through 4th millennia BC, and proto-cuneiform material from the later Uruk and Jemdet Nasr periods. Ubaid material is generally pre-writing. Proto-cuneiform belongs to the early phases of administrative writing. Mixing the two categories collapses centuries of cultural evolution into a single label. Cylinder seals deserve specific attention. A cylinder seal is a small carved cylinder, typically a few centimeters tall, rolled across wet clay to produce an impression. Seals carried administrative authority, identified owners, marked transactions, and depicted mythic scenes. They preserve administration, ownership, religious imagery, and early social hierarchy in compressed form. A single seal can carry as much information as a small inscription. 5,000 of them, missing into private collections, represent an enormous loss of primary evidence for the first urban civilizations. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, now operating as the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, built the lost treasures from Iraq database to support recovery efforts. The database compiled photographs, catalog cards, excavation images, and scholar snapshots to create searchable records of missing objects. Customs officers, FBI agents, UNESCO officials, and academic researchers all use such databases to identify objects appearing on the antiquities market. Looting destroys context, even when objects eventually return. A cylinder seal that surfaces in a Geneva auction house decades later may be physically intact, but the information about which excavation level it came from, which structure it was associated with, and which other artifacts surrounded it is usually gone. Small artifacts move easily through black markets, private collectors, and falsified provenance documents. A photograph taken inside the museum before 2003 can become an artifact's passport back from the market. The museum lost not only objects, it lost chains of evidence leading back to the birth of cities. Across these 10 cases, a pattern emerges. The question of why some discoveries vanish permanently while others remain only partly lost has more than one answer. The mainstream explanation is the simplest. Most losses came from ordinary historical forces: war, looting, the limits of early excavation, environmental exposure, and museum vulnerability. Peking Man fits this pattern. A wartime evacuation created a high-risk transport chain that broke at exactly the wrong moment. Berlin fits it too. Bombing and architectural collapse destroyed material that could not be moved fast enough. The Iraq Museum reflects a post-invasion security collapse that opened a looting window before any institution could respond. Lascaux represents a different version of the same logic. Public access disrupted a closed cave microclimate that had stabilized over 20,000 years. A second explanation, drawn from archaeological and historical practice, reframes the question. Many discoveries that appear to have vanished did not vanish physically. Their context vanished. Solo Man survives as a set of skulls, but the field documentation around them is incomplete. Tabun Woman survives as bones, but the articulated burial relationship is gone. The Calaveras Skull survives in museum custody, but its scientific credibility was destroyed by hoax allegations. Mungo Man was not lost. He was returned, through cultural decision-making, to ancestral ground. A third explanation, more speculative, surrounds some of the cases with rumors of hidden caches, stolen private collections, military concealment, or secret buyers. Peking Man is the strongest candidate. Decades of unverified claims have suggested the crates were hidden by individuals, buried somewhere in northern China, or sunk on a specific, identifiable ship. Some accounts even claim the fossils made it to Japan, or to a private collector. None has produced physical evidence. Wartime confusion is a powerful generator of legend. Missing artifacts almost always attract black market theories, particularly when the original chain of custody is broken. Plausible speculation, however, must be separated from unsupported claim. Each theory explains a different kind of disappearance, and no single framework covers all 10 cases. The role of photography deserves its own examination. Across these cases, photographs function not as illustration, but as primary evidence. For Peking Man, casts and photographs replaced nearly 200 missing fossils. Scientific use of those photographs requires scale references, rulers, labels, controlled angles, and consistent lighting. Casts and photographs preserve different things. Casts capture three-dimensional shape. Photographs capture condition, surface state, and spatial arrangement. Tabun Woman demonstrates how an in situ photograph can preserve burial posture that disappears the moment the skeleton is lifted. Lascaux shows how photographs preserve color saturation and surface state before human damage. The Iraq Museum recovery effort depends on photographs to identify stolen objects in private hands. Tel Halaf shows archival images guiding the reassembly of shattered sculptures from tens of thousands of fragments. Photographs have limits. They cannot deliver DNA, collagen, isotope ratios, microscopic structure, or unrecorded surfaces. They preserve what the camera saw and nothing more. Glass plate photography, introduced in the 19th century, provided early high-resolution archival capacity that still rewards modern digital scanning. Excavation photographs serve as frozen field notes. Lighting angle matters enormously, especially for engravings, cracks, pigment layers, and bone surfaces, where a single shift in light can reveal or conceal critical features. Measurement distortion is a constant risk when photographs lack scale bars or perspective control. Modern photogrammetry combines many overlapping images to generate three-dimensional models, partially compensating for the flatness of older records. Old images can also be digitally enhanced to recover details lost to fading or low resolution. No photograph is fully neutral. The photographer chose the angle, framing, focus, and exposure, and those choices shape what later researchers see. A photograph cannot prove everything, but it prevents total erasure. The mechanisms of vanishing can be sorted more systematically. Peking Man represents war transport loss. Solo Man reflects war disruption that complicated context without destroying the objects. Berlin reflects bombing destruction of museum infrastructure. Mosul reflects deliberate iconoclasm performed for propaganda. The Iraq Museum reflects looting during a security collapse. Stara Zagora reflects exposure decay, the slow chemistry of air and salt. Lascaux reflects microclimate collapse driven by visitor pressure. Tabun reflects excavation removal that destroyed an articulated burial scene. Mungo Man reflects access loss through repatriation and reburial. Calaveras reflects provenance collapse driven by hoax exposure. These mechanisms can be grouped into 5 categories of loss: object loss, context loss, condition loss, access loss, and credibility loss. Peking Man and the Iraq Museum show object loss. Solo Man and Tabun Woman show context loss. Lascaux and Stara Zagora show condition loss. Mungo Man shows access loss. Calaveras shows credibility loss. The real question is not where the evidence went. The question is what kind of evidence disappeared. Ethical questions thread through several of the cases. Ancient human remains are not just specimens. They were people. Mungo Man was simultaneously an ancestor, a cultural figure, and a scientific subject. The tension between research access and community authority shaped the entire arc of his custody, from removal in 1974 to reburial in 2022. Repatriation changes the scientific archive without being a scientific failure. It changes the rules of access, but it does not erase the photographs, casts, dates, and measurements already on the record. Comparing cases sharpens the picture. Mungo Man was returned through cultural decision-making. Peking Man was lost against everyone's wishes. Tabun Woman was removed under early 20th century excavation norms that paid limited attention to local communities. Jokudian and Mount Carmel both carry colonial-era excavation histories, with foreign expertise leading work that involved local populations primarily as laborers and contextual figures. Museum custody can function as preservation, but it can also function as displacement, and the two are not always easy to separate. Photographs intersect with these questions as well. They preserve scientific access, but they can also raise cultural sensitivities. Some communities prefer that images of ancestral remains not circulate publicly. Documentary framing matters. Treating reburial as theft or destruction misrepresents what actually happened in cases like Mungo Man. Wording such as inaccessible to science is more accurate than lost forever for remains that were returned. Some indigenous and local communities prefer keeping places, secured facilities under cultural control, over either full reburial or full museum retention. Iraq and Mosul add another layer. Heritage belongs to living communities, not only to scholars and museums. Black market objects are stolen public memory, as well as stolen physical objects. Preservation is political, legal, spiritual, and technical at the same time. None of these dimensions cancels the others. Returning to the 10 cases with this framework sharpens what each one represents. Peking Man stands as the clearest example of total loss of original fossil material, recoverable only through casts and photographs. Solo Man represents partial loss of context rather than specimens, with the bones surviving but the field documentation weakened. Calaveras shows that provenance, once lost or discredited, can kill a discovery while the object stays on a museum shelf. Mungo Man shows access ending through repatriation, with photographs and reports continuing to serve as the scientific record. Tabun Woman represents the loss of body position and sediment relationship. The bones survived, the burial scene did not. Berlin represents the destruction of collection continuity through war, with archival catalogs and pre-war photographs carrying forward the memory of what was held. Stara Zagora represents the threat of environmental exposure to fragile architecture, defended by conservation, climate control, and consistent documentation. Lascaux represents the loss of original color saturation and the cave's pre-public atmospheric state, preserved now only in photographs and substitute replicas. Mosul represents destruction recorded by cameras, with the same medium that documented the destruction also enabling later identification and partial reconstruction efforts. Tel Halaf represents destruction, reversed through archival comparison, where pre-war photographs guided the reassembly of tens of thousands of fragments. The Iraq Museum represents the mass disappearance of portable artifacts into uncertain ownership, with photographic databases serving as the recovery infrastructure. Across all 10 cases, the theme is not simply disappearance, it is dependency on secondary records. Photographs, casts, drawings, measurements, field notes, catalogs, inventories, and replicas now do work that the original evidence cannot. These records preserve shape, arrangement, labels, color, relative position, and public memory. They cannot preserve chemistry, original context, molecular traces, handling history, or the full three-dimensional weight of an object in space. The lesson for modern archaeology is procedural. Scan early. Photograph everything. Record context obsessively. Duplicate archives across multiple institutions. Store data internationally. Emergency heritage response, developed in war zones and now extending to climate risk sites, treats this kind of documentation as protection of last resort. Digital replicas function as backup rather than replacement, useful when the original is gone, but never equivalent to direct study. The recurring image, across cases separated by continents and centuries, is the camera flash as the last witness before evidence changes. A skull crated for shipment, a skeleton lifted from a cave floor, a burial returned to country, a bull painted on a cave wall, a relief carved for an Aramaean palace, a cylinder seal pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago. Each one was photographed shortly before something about it stopped being reachable. Prehistory does not vanish all at once. Sometimes it disappears as a crate, a context, a color, a right of access, or a single missing label. The evidence that remains in the form of photographs, casts, and field records is the foundation on which everything else now stands.